Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So today I wanted to show you how to use Tim Holtz Distress Embossing Glazes. These are transparent embossing powders, and this makes them different than most other embossing powders that are fully opaque. So you can get some really different uses for them. You can layer them, you can do some more interesting things with them. And as I've been experimenting with them, I wanted to share with you some of the things that I have personally learned about these powders, and I'm hoping that this can help you learn how to use them effectively and give you some ideas about how you can use them on your projects. As well, I'm going to be using some Distress Embossing ink, some archival eject back ink, as well as some Distress Oxide inks on tags. As well too, if you have some gloss medium and some tissue paper, I'm using these to make some different backgrounds as well to add the glazes to. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do today is actually add some tissue paper to my tag using this gloss medium. Basically, you can use any sort of more liquid medium. With tissue paper being as thin as it is, you do not need a super heavy medium to put this on. I know Tim Holtz has his own range of mediums, but I particularly like this acrylics gloss medium. I got it at the art store and it's been working really good so far. So you want to add a little bit to the tag, because basically this matte medium is going to act like glue to help adhere this tissue paper to the tag. I'm just basically taking a section, laying it down, and then I'm just going to add some medium over top. This tissue paper is actually, what I really like about this particular one is it's a little bit stronger than some of the other ones that I use in my projects. I've actually used everything from napkins to other things to do this type of technique on, and really the sky's the limit. But it is nice to be able to find some stuff that actually like adheres well to the tag. Okay, so that has a nice thick layer of medium. I've tucked the edges, everything is nicely glued down. And as you can still see the color of the tag underneath it. It's just meant to add a little bit more texture and interest. So I would actually wash your brush right away, just so that you don't end up turning it into a solid mass, because the matte medium the gloss medium is glue, and that glue is going to wreck your brushes. So if you do not rinse them right away. So I'm going to move this off to the side, and I'll get started on some of the other techniques. So the first thing I wanted to show you with these tags is actually how to add the embossing powder to them. So you want to use your thing of embossing ink. This is actually a clean sponge. It looks a little dirty, but I actually rinse them after every use, just so that I know that they're coming in clean when I'm using it in my embossing ink. And my embossing ink doesn't look very pretty, but it actually does come out of the ink pad completely fine. So you're not getting any sort of other colors in it. And so in this case, I'm just dabbing, and I'm just going to do this across in this pattern. It will be clear in a minute why I'm doing this. So basically add some embossing ink to that. Then the most important thing is embossing ink does get everywhere, so you don't want to necessarily just do it on any surface. I'm actually putting this inside a box. I'm using a scrap piece of paper to pour my embossing powder on. In this case, I am going to use the cracked pistachio. The cracked pistachio is a color for me that I really, really like. And so you just want to sprinkle some of it on. And I'm just going to let it go down. And you can sprinkle a little bit of extra on, like so. Again, not a perfect line. If you want a more perfect line on this, just grab yourself an old paintbrush, and you can just take off what you don't want, and as long as the embossing powder isn't whatever the embossing powder is sticking to, it will melt, and anything else it won't. So it's one of those things that you can actually adjust your shape as you go if you need to. And now I'm going to actually heat set this tag. So there you go, half of it is heat set now. Now I'm going to actually remove my box, add embossing ink to the other side. And you can actually see here, you may not be able to see in the camera, there is a very light spot where you can see where it's actually gotten more dull, where I've actually added a little bit of embossing ink on top of the previous embossed area. And it's to be, you should be really aware whether or not you're overlapping or not, because this is a semi-transparent or transparent, I'm not sure what you would consider it, embossing powder, you will actually be able to see it when you put it down. So what you have here is you have the cracked pistachio on one side, you have the broken china on the other, and then you can get this other color going through where I have actually I overlap the two embossing powders. So that's something that you can do with these things, is you can actually overlap color and add a little bit more interest. And I'm going to take this one more step further before we move on to the next tag. So now that you have the two colors on this tag, the next thing I want to do is actually add some embossing ink through a stencil to add some more interest. So in this case, I'm using the same embossing ink. This is the Bubble Stencil by Tim Holtz. It's one of his new ones. I really like this design. It's probably one of my favorites of his in a while. I love his stencils, but this is hitting the top of my list for sure. I think it's so versatile in ways you can use it. I really like the difference in the textures and in the size of the texture. And the key with this is to work your way down, circular motion, and make sure that you get all the spots to the stencil, and try not to move the stencil much as you work. You can also tape down your stencil to try to get a cleaner image. So I have now added the embossing ink. I'm going to grab my box again so that I do not have a mess. And I'm going to add some of my embossing powder. And this one is the Weathered Wood. So this one's a really neat color just because it's so light. So if you're looking for subtle variation in colors, this is definitely the powder to choose. Just make sure you heat set it. So as you can see, the pistachio reacts differently to the weathered wood than the broken china. So depending on how you want to use these powders, you can add more than one layer, and by adding the different layers you can get a different effect and a different reaction because they are semi-transparent powders. I really want to show this to show you where you could go with some of the colors, where again you can have intermediate colors by overlapping certain colors or by combining different colors. So this is showing basically how to do it with one color and then another. On my next tag, I'm going to mix this up and show you a different way you can mix these colors. So now that this is dry, the first thing you want to do is actually just cut around it. I know some people like to just tear it. I actually like having a nice clean edge on these tags. And that way too, if something didn't adhere quite perfectly, then at least then you don't have big gaps along the edges, unless that's what you're looking for. So, and sometimes this comes across a tiny bit tacky. So if you're running into a little bit of tackiness on your tag, I have this thing, I've had this thing for years. It's basically a powder that's in this little bag, and it's used for embossing. So if you don't want things to stick in places they're not supposed to, if you basically take this little bag and place it over top, it removes any of those tacky areas or areas that would stick to help you get a better image. So I'm going to use the Tim Holtz Lattice Work stencil and add my Distress Embossing ink through it again. And again, move in a circular motion. Try to work from top to bottom. Try to make sure that you end up having an even amount of embossing powder over your tag. One thing I did notice about these embossing powders is they actually have a very fine finish to them, which you probably actually noticed that the powder isn't super thick or chunky. It's actually quite fine. So using just a regular embossing ink is the best way to go for getting really good results with this. You don't really need to be super heavy-handed with the Distress Embossing ink because it will be fine on its own. Put it in our box, and I'm going to do this a little bit differently this time. I'm going to start with the Hickory Smoke. It's nothing like a good semi-transparent dark color. I'm just going to add that embossing ink, or sorry, not embossing ink, embossing powder. And I'm going to move on to the broken china next. So instead of heat setting between each one, I am going to let these colors combine a little bit. I'm actually trying to overlap it a bit so some of the powder goes over the black area of the powder, just to give it a little bit of a softer look to it. And then lastly, I'm going to use some cracked pistachio. Finish off the top of this tag. So again, you can see a little bit more subtlety there than just doing the really straight lines that I did on the last tag. And having like a really strong overlap mark. Again, it depends what you're looking to do. You may really want that strong overlap mark. Sometimes you don't though. So there you can see that compared to this tag, where you have the really stark lines, by actually combining the 3 embossing powders on the tag before you melt it, you can get a much softer look to it. So again, if you want really strong lines, you can go that way. You can also get these softer lines. And the reason I wanted to do this on the tissue paper is you can see that all that musical etching on the tissue paper has come through clearly. So even though this is an embossing powder, you're able to see your image underneath, which is really something that's special about this particular powder. You can get some different techniques than you ever could with an opaque embossing powder. So I'm going to show you how to add a few of these techniques together to get a tag that you can just use in your book. These ones I think are really good bases of other tags that you can do, and I may actually add to these in later videos. So now I do is add my Hero Arts bird stamp and my Ranger archival ink to create an image on this tag. One thing you may want to be aware of is that if you're going to be adding embossing powder, it is better to actually add your image for this transparent embossing powder first, because it's going to be harder to get a really crisp image when you already have something that it has a little bit more dimension on the surface. There's my little bird. So now I'm going to add this Tim Holtz stencil on top. So I'm going to use again my Distress Embossing ink. And I want to add on the whole image, including the bird stamp. In this situation, I'm going to actually use the Fired Brick embossing powder on this image. And any spots that you think are not have quite enough embossing powder, you can always add just a little bit more. So once this is melted, the next thing you want to do is add color to the bird itself. So one thing I did buy this year was the Distress Embossing Pens. It comes in both a brush and a bullet, and I find both of them have been really fun to play with as I've been trying to work on these techniques. So in this case, I'm just going to use the brush because it covers a little bit more area, and I'm going to just use the pen to add embossing powder to the breast of this bird. So you'll notice that it's going red. I noticed that for some reason the embossing ink, even though this is heat set, likes to pick up a little bit of the color from the color underneath, and I'm not too sure why that is. It seems to react in some way. So I've just realized that I just got to clean my brush pen after I finish a color. For example, I have a piece of dictionary paper here, and just wipe your pen on the edge of it until you actually get it nice and clear and the color's clear again. So in this case, I'm actually going to go back to using the red because I like the idea of this robin being a little bit more true to life. So you can see that the red of the bird is now the same red as the background, but it sticks out a little bit more just because of the fact that it's a little bit more solid. But you'll also notice there's still some red on top of the bird here. So I'm now going to use my embossing pen again and brush in some other colors. And now I'm actually going to add the cracked pistachio. It might seem like a strange color to add to this bird, but you'll see as I go that you end up kind of getting an interesting effect with this. So you'll see now that because I've added the green, I've ended up with this kind of red, brown, green mix in there. And so I'm going to take my piece of book paper again and clean off my nib as much as I can. These brush nibs, they might get a little bit stained at the end, but they will generally come clear to the color that you want. You just don't want too much muddiness in it while you're working on this. So the next thing I'm going to do is add some highlights where I'm not coloring the entire bird. I'm doing some areas of the wings, some areas of the head, some areas that maybe I want a little bit more color. And I am going to do this in the broken china. So you can see there that, again, it only covered certain areas, not the whole thing, and that's the beauty of those Distress ink embossing pens. So as you can see, you have a little bit of blue, a little bit of green, a little bit of the red popping through. You have more of this brown color because, again, as you're mixing these colors, you start with red, but then when you add green, you're going to end up with a little bit more of these brown tones. So instead of looking at going, I only have 6 of the embossing colors, and most of them are on like red, blues, greens, and a black. So what do you do when you need to try to get some other colors in there? You don't necessarily have to buy all the colors. Instead, what you can do is kind of figure out how do those colors work well together. So in this particular case, this bird, I had tried before to use the hickory smoke for doing the eye, and it wasn't actually dark enough. In this case, I do want to have a slightly darker eye, so I'm using my Copic sketch marker just to color that in, just so it's nice and dark. But one thing I do find is it makes the eye kind of lifeless, so I'm using my white Jelly Roll pen, and I'm doing a tiny little catch light in the eye to give him a little bit more life. So now it's trying to make sure that he kind of separates from the background, because again, we have this great image, we have all this great red and all this great pattern, but then how do we separate it so it actually pops a little bit more? So I'm going to start by grabbing some of my Distress Oxide inks and add a little bit more interest to this little bird. And again, I do clean all my pads, so even though the colors may not, like these look pretty nasty, but they're actually clean and they won't mix colors badly. So that's why I always clean them, and then that way I can use them with whatever, and then I don't really have to care if the color matches necessarily. So I'm going to start with trying to create a little bit of a foreground for our little bird here. So again, he seems like he's floating in air right now. So the key is to add a little bit of Distress Oxide ink around the bird himself. And this one I am actually using is Vintage Photo. And you'll notice that it's actually dulling the embossing a little bit, but I will clean that up after we actually finish inking. So this is the beauty of embossing, is you end up with some really interesting techniques, and you can always bring the embossing back to the foreground, or you can let it stay muted. It's really up to you what you really prefer to see. So in this case, I'm going to use a combination of 4 blues. So I'm going to start with Broken China. I'm going to add a little bit of Mermaid Lagoon. Throw in a little bit of Blueprint Sketch. And I just throw a little bit more Broken China there. I'm going to use the Blueprint Sketch to do a few little lines down here. Give him a little bit of shadow, because where he'd be standing in, he would have a little bit of shadow on him depending on the direction of the light. So again, that adds a little bit more interest. And then the next thing I like to do is actually spritz the whole thing with a little bit of water. I like it because it allows the oxides themselves to react. Put a paper towel over. And you can see again, it's subtle. It's made it a little bit more subtle. It's made the background a little bit more subtle to the rest of it. And now I am actually going to use my wet paper towel. Just try to find a little clean corner of your paper towel. Spritz it with a little bit of water. And then I run it over top of the embossing, because that pulls up any little bits of ink that might be remaining on the embossing and allows our little bird to actually stick out a little bit more. And then by doing it on the rest of it, that pops a little bit more. So again, it goes from being dull to being really vibrant. The nice thing about embossing inks is because they resist the ink that is put on top of it, you can end up with these really interesting backgrounds and be able to add extra layers and have extra color and not have it look funny, but instead have it really pop and add more dimension. You might wonder why I'm using embossing inks instead of just coloring this in with pens and then maybe adding some glossy accents or some other sort of glossy medium. The nice thing about this is this dries really quickly. Like usually with glossy accents, you're talking hours. This is seconds. And so by adding this in this way, and by sometimes just the way that the embossing powders meld together, you end up with a much more interesting final product than you would if you were doing it with a different medium in a different way. It allows a little bit more looseness in your style and allows you to kind of work with the medium instead of working against it. So here are the 3 tags that we've done today. Again, all slightly different ways and different ways of testing and trying out this embossing powder so that you can get familiar with what you're using and can create with it in a lot more confidence. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and provide a comment below. I hope that you have a great week, and I will see you next time.